Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I want to talk a little bit about some comic book adaptations, primarily Netflix's Locke and Key. So it's been out for a little bit now, and I want to talk to you guys about it. If you guys haven't read the comics, they are written by Joe Hill, who is a fantastic horror author in his own right, but he also just happens to be the son of Stephen King, which is perhaps neither here nor there, but a really cool fact regardless. And the artist, Gabriel Rodriguez. So they have a couple of things that they have to say about the new Netflix series, and have been recently interviewed about it. Also, the show in general is just pretty cool, I think. So if you haven't seen Locke and Key yet, it's about the Locke family, L-O-C-K-E, and they live in this place now called Key House. And there are a ton of different magical keys in the house that do magical things. It's a very punny title, which I enjoy. You could think of it as being kitschy, but I enjoy a good pun. The overall concept is really cool as well, and it's more violent in a lot of ways than Narnia, like more real-world violence, but it's not nearly as hardcore as October Faction or as The Magicians. Like, there's not all the cussing and other shenanigans going on in Locke and Key like there is in The Magicians. There's a little bit of cussing, but it's very rare, few and far between. But the concept of the show is that the father of these three kids had a similar experience with these keys when he was a kid. And all of the people who had been keeping the keys have died over the years, except for like two. They just gradually die of weird things. Weird things happen to them. So the dad dies in the very first episode. Like, we start out knowing that he's dead, really. And the mom and the kids are moving to Key House. So in the comic, Sam Lesser is a kid who goes to school with Tyler, the oldest boy in the family. And Tyler's about 16, 17. Tyler's dad, Rendell, was like the school counselor, and this kid, Sam, was having a really hard time. He was displaying some aberrant behavior, and he got sent to Rendell's office to go and talk to him. And Rendell was a very nice dude and was trying very hard to be helpful with this kid, but the office that Rendell is using also has a portrait on the wall of Key House. It has this really nice picture. It looks like it might have been charcoal or a graphite drawing. And it has Key House and the well house and stuff in it. And so while Sam is in his office, Sam hears a voice calling to him from the picture. And he listens to it. And it is this woman trying to convince him to find out more about Key House and to obtain some keys for her. So Sam is already in a disturbed point in his life and having a lot of trouble. So he's like, okay, yeah. He doesn't have a lot of friends anyway. And Rendell has his son Tyler hang out with Sam some more. But Sam and Tyler actually do get along, and Tyler ends up really liking Sam, even though he first does this as just a favor to his dad. But then at one point, Sam just kind of loses it because he can't obtain the keys for this woman who lives in the well house and he's trying to please. And she's super manipulative, and Sam kind of loses it, and he kills the dad. He's trying to get the information from him, and the dad won't give it to him, so he kills the dad and tries to kill the rest of the family as well, but is stopped and imprisoned. So that's all pretty much known in the very first episode. And then the kids move to this new house. Well, for them it's new. For their dad it's old. It's the one that he grew up in. So the mom takes them to go and live there. And while they're in Key House, the littlest one, Bodhi, who's probably about 10, 11 years old, Bodhi starts hearing these keys whispering to him, and he hears the lady in the well house, whom he calls Echo for a while, talking to him, and she tells him, hey, yeah, you'll hear the keys whispering too. When you hear that whispering, go and find them out and bring them to me. She's looking for a very specific key. And so Bodhi goes and starts looking for the keys for his secret friend. There are 12 keys collected by Bodhi, Tyler, and their sister, Kinsey. Kinsey is the middle child as well, and she's probably about 14 or 15. I don't think she's quite old enough to drive yet, but she is old enough to be out in the town by herself with her friends a lot. So in the meantime, they are keeping these keys, but once they figure out that the lady in the well house is evil, then they start trying to protect the keys. The keys are really cool, and they do a whole bunch of different things. So I'm going to explain the keys for you right here. If you don't want the spoilers, then I'd skip ahead at least 10 minutes and go from there. So there are a couple of different really cool ones. The ghost key I really like. That allows the user to leave their body and become a ghost when you stick the key into a specific key house door. The lock and the key really have to match each other, or the door and the key, rather, have to match each other. So the ghost key has the skull symbol on it, and while you're a ghost, you can fly around and interact with other ghosts, but the living can't see you, and your body looks like a corpse on the ground. You look almost like a pallid bluish gray color as well, and you don't really have a pulse. But you're still alive, and as long as you keep the door open that you unlock to go through, you can come right back to your body. So that's really cool, and in the show we get to see Bodhi really use that key to meet the ghost of his ancestors who've been buried on the property, because this is a very old historic home that's been passed down for generations. It's very similar in look and manner to the large house that is in October Faction. The shows do have a lot in common, but in this case, the family is just a normal family that has more of a magical history, whereas it's more of military secrets and stuff being kept from the kids in October Faction. So I really like the ghost key, and you have to keep the door open or you will die. The person who's left their body will die. So if you close it, bad news bears. For the echo key, that's used to summon an echo of a deceased person from the key house's well house. At a certain point, someone uses it to bring back another character, and it unleashes the demon that had inhabited their body instead. So an echo looks like your friend who had died, but it's not an exact copy. The echo is also trapped in the well house unless they get a hold of the anywhere key. So the anywhere key is really awesome. You can stick that into any lock, and when you do it, you think about the place that you want to go. And when you stick it in there, you can go anywhere that you've seen the location of a door that you can picture in your mind. You have to think about what that door looks like in order to travel through it. So you can't just go, hey, I'm going to go to the Knoxville Zoo today. If you don't know what the door to that place looks like, and you can't envision it, then you're not going to be able to go there. So you need to be able to visualize that door, or know what it looks like at least, in order to go there. I think that that's really cool, and that's the only way the Echo can get out of the well house, is getting a hold of the Anywhere key. So that is the first one that Bodhi finds in the well house, and that the person claiming to be his Echo really tells him to go and seek out, because that's the one that she needs. Now she does that under false pretenses, and the poor kid gets bamboozled. Feel a little bit bad for Bodhi, but also, I mean, he's a kid. This person told him to keep a secret from the rest of his family and be like, hey, don't tell them that you were at the well house, because, you know, they might be really upset with you because it's not safe here, and I'm sure you're not supposed to be here. And that's just a tactic that a lot of abusers use in general. It's very manipulative. And so it's like, you know, you can't tell anybody about this. You would get in trouble for this, right? So she uses a lot of different types of these techniques on Bodhi throughout the story. And I find that to be very interesting. The way that she is kind of mimicking and giving allusions to real life abusers as it goes along. I think it's pretty fascinating, and I'm really enjoying the show. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about some of the other keys.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, I was giving you guys the background story for Locke and Key, the Netflix show, as well as the comics. And we talked a little bit about the first 3 keys. So now we're going to talk about some more keys. They have a key called the head key. That one is one of my favorites, just because it's so creepy looking too. So the head key, you stick it into the back of a person's neck. You can stick it in your own neck or in anyone's neck and turn it, and it opens a door to the inside of a person's head. Sometimes that door looks like the door to their high school or to their home. And when you go in there, you can see that person's memories. If you stick it into your own head, or when somebody sticks it into your head, it makes kind of a copy of you, so your body is frozen, but you have another corporeal body that can go into the memories. So you can actually go through the door yourself as well, even if you're standing there frozen with the key in the back of your neck, because the other you can do it. So when you go into your memories and your knowledge and your emotions, some of them can be represented by real, people. Like they are anthropomorphic personifications of your emotions. We see that most clearly with Kenzie's fear. So Kenzie's fear looks a lot like Kenzie, but with really pallid skin and crazy, just gross hair. It's really greasy and stringy, and the color is muted out of it, and she has almost claws at a certain point, and looks like she's wearing a lot of really gross makeup, as one character puts it, like gray stage makeup and stuff, monster makeup. So the fear is also very aggressive, and it will attack different people and stuff. So when you go into your head, it's not necessarily always safe to do so. The door and headspace is different for each person, and it complements their personality. So the inside of Kinsey's head looks a lot different than the inside of Sam's head and any of the other characters that we get to see. When you use the key, you can put things into someone's head, and you can also take things out. So you can put in knowledge by just chucking a book in there. We see Tyler do that with a history book at one point, and I really wish it were that easy. If we had the head key, you guys, we would be unstoppable. But he throws all kinds of information in there, and then we see other characters pull out certain things from their brain, parts of themselves that they did not want, that they don't think really serves them. But as time goes on, they kind of realize, hey, even these negative emotions have a place in our lives, and I think that that's really important for us to really consider. We think of fear and guilt and a lot of our other emotions as being inherently negative, but emotions in and of themselves are not negative. It's what we do about them, our reactions to them, that are truly negative. So I think it's really great that Locke and Key really explores that concept and looks into conquering our fears in a certain way and addressing them in different ways rather than just removing them completely. Because when you just go ahead and remove that, it removes not only your fear, but also a lot of your inhibitions. A lot of things we don't do because they give us a little bit of fear or nervousness or anxiety, and a little bit of that is healthy. All things in moderation. But having a lot of it, I can understand why someone would want to take that out of their brains. If you could just pull depression out of your brain or something, that would be dope. But it might also, come with all of your sadness. It just depends on what exactly is in your head at the time. And it's going to look different depending on which emotion and stuff it is as well. They can also go in and look at a person's memories as well. I think that is really cool. So with Kenzie's, it's a little colorful box, and so she can pull it down and, watch her father read her bedtime stories and stuff. I think that's really lovely. And for other characters, it looks like you're opening a book, but when you open up the book, it's more tablet style on the inside. So I think the different representations are really cool. Visually, it's a really neat show, and I really like the head key a lot. It functions a bit differently in the show than it does in the comics, though. So there are a lot of things that you can tell in a story, a lot of elements that aren't really conveyed the same way in TV adaptations. In the comics, the head key will literally tilt the top of someone's head open, and you can look inside their head and see how their brain works. That just didn't really work well when they tried to adapt it for TV. And in the comics, it's a really cool panel of what's inside Bodhi's head, but it's not something that translated well on the show. It looked more like brain surgery, according to the people who were involved in it. So they were trying to come up with a metaphoric way to do it. And I really like where they went with it. They said they took a little bit of inspiration from Inception and the worlds within worlds kind of concept. And I really enjoyed that. Although it is a major deviation from the comics, but overall, it was something that they really liked. So it's okay that it's a little bit different. I know some people are going to be disappointed by it, but, we just have to really think about the limits of different types of storytelling. That's really important in this case. So I get why people would maybe be upset about it, but it's just so hard to create some of those things visually. And instead of kind of phoning it in or doing a half version of it, they decided to just go a different route. So I think that's really great, and I like how it turned out. There's another key called the shadow key, and the shadow key is used in conjunction with a crown of shadows. So when you use the two together, it allows the person wearing them to control some shadow-like creatures. That is so terrifying. They can use them for good, they can use them for evil, It's whatever they want. But they can use these shadow type creatures to come after anyone that they want, to just serve out their purposes. It's kind of terrifying in a way. And it's very interesting to me how people use shadows in stories. I always think, when they're like, oh yeah, turn on all the lights so there are no shadows. I'm like, well, light creates shadow, so shouldn't you really turn out all the lights? And then there are no shadows, only darkness. But, I digress. That is just my personal opinion, but it's interesting how they use this concept in the show. One of my favorite keys is the mending cabinet key. There is there's beauty and such heartbreak in that as well when you watch the characters try to use it. And there's a cabinet that they pull out of the basement called the mending cabinet. And they think at first that it doesn't do anything. Bodhi is like, oh, maybe this is like Narnia because it looks kind of like a wardrobe. And so he puts the key into the mending cabinet and goes in and is like, what the heck? This one's broken. And he's really bummed out by it. But later on, the mom kind of figures it out by accident. And she has broken a mug and she just doesn't want to deal with it right now. And she sticks the mug into the cabinet and locks it. And then when she goes to open it later, the mug is totally mended. It looks like nothing ever happened to it. And then, she starts freaking out. She's been through a lot at this point and has started drinking again. And so she's like ripping up books and stuff and throwing it in there. Anything broken that she can find, she sticks it in there. Anything that is not broken, like she'll just break it and toss it in there. And she's like, I feel like I'm crazy, but I'm not crazy. Meanwhile, the kids are trying to figure out how to explain this to her, because the thing is with adults, they can't remember anything about the magic. They all forget about it. And I thought that was neat, and it's a theme we've seen in other shows about magic, in which, once you get to a certain age, you can't go to Narnia anymore, or you can't really access magic anymore, or you can't remember it. The memories fade. And so those types of experiences pass on to a younger generation. I think that that's really neat, and I like how they use it to tell the story. But in this case, by removing Nina's inhibitions, by drinking, she begins to remember certain things about magic. But when she drinks, things go poorly. So Nina is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and so are the kids, by going, okay, well, if we let her drink, then she's going to remember these things and we can actually talk to her about it, but she's going to be drunk and miserable, and it's going to be terrible like it was before, right after Dad died. But if we don't tell her, or if we don't let her drink, then she's not going to remember anything, and we're still going to be detached from her. So it's a lose-lose situation, but they really have to put her health first. So it's a really interesting philosophical conundrum to watch these kids have to go through. It's really beautiful the way that they care about their mom, and you can also see Tyler really stepping up to be the man of the house. And it's heart-wrenching in a lot of ways, because that really happens to young people, having to be the parents to their parents in a lot of situations, but also because his dad died and now he has these two younger siblings and his mom's not entirely functional. So it's not just being a parent to his parent, but also to the kids. And it's a really heavy burden on Tyler. And we see that at that point when Nina has smashed something in the floor, and it's a really big deal. And Tyler looks at her and he goes, Mom, I'll clean it up. It's okay. You go lay down. And he's just approaching it so calmly, because this is not his first emotional outburst with his mother. This is the first one that we have seen on screen, but you can tell that this has happened before, something similar, when she was really emotional after the death of their father initially. And it's really beautiful the way that they play out these personal relationships and this coming of age story. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some more keys.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about the shadow key, the head key, and the mending cabinet key. Now we're going to talk about a couple of other keys. There is a music box key that is really pretty, but it lets the person who inserts it inside the music box to have complete control over other people. So if you were the one who put the key in there, then it will only listen to you while it is in there. Someone else, in order to use it, would have to remove the key and then reinsert it to have that power. We see how tempting it is for a lot of folks to use it, and they use it for not so great purposes, but I mean, they are children. So that's what children do. They're learning to control their impulses, and that includes the impulse to lash back out at people who have been mean to them. So it's really interesting to see how they utilize this and who the kids share the knowledge with. A lot of times I'm like, no, you need to stop telling people. But then other times it's like, okay, maybe it's time to really tell somebody at this point. So the music box is one of the first ones that they share with other people. And it's really interesting to see how that works and what they do with it. The matchstick key is pretty much just a really fancy lighter. You can scrape it along a lot of things, and like just on the wall, you strike it like a match kind of, and it will set the walls on fire. It will set everything around you on fire. We even see one character try to prevent keys from falling into the wrong hands by sticking that key into their heart and setting themselves and their entire home on fire. So the matchstick key doesn't necessarily need a lock. It can be used on the body very similarly to the head key, and it can also be used just on walls and stuff. So it's a little bit different from a lot of the other keys in that regard. There's another really cool one that creeps me out called the identity key. So this one, if you have trypophobia, you're not going to maybe like this key or the head key. It makes a keyhole in your body. So the head key goes into the back of your neck, whereas the identity key goes underneath your chin. So on the bottom side of your chin. So they tilt their heads up and then stick the key in and turn it. And it allows you to change your visual appearance to look like another person. So you can change the identity of people other than yourself as well. You can put the key into another person just like you can the head key, or into yourself, and can cause other people to look like anyone that you want, really. Anyone that you've seen, you can alter their appearance to be like that. It's really interesting how that one works and the different faces that different characters choose to wear. And it's not just the face. It's more like the Harry Potter polyjuice potion, so it's going to change your entire body. But it's going to stay that way until you stick the key in there and turn it again. So you can appear as that person for however long you want, unlike polyjuice potions, which have limitations. So I like that one a lot. It can be used for super nefarious purposes, and you may see that in the show as well. There is a mirror key that we find early on, and it opens a mirror portal. It's super creepy. It doesn't have a lock per se, but you stick the key into the mirror and turn it. So the keyhole pops up in the mirror at that point, very similarly to how the head key and the identity key will create one in your body when you go to use the key. But the keyhole's not there all the time. So the mirror key, you stick it into a specific mirror, and it opens the mirror portal to a place called the prison of the self. And it's just this crazy mirror world that people tend to get lost in, and a lot of people have died trying to escape. So I do like how dark a lot of this show is. It's a horror show, and it goes in depth with these really dark elements. Some of the keys do some really cool, innocuous things, and others are like, okay, this is really just meant for death. But also a lot of them can be used for good or evil. I have not seen anything good so far regarding the mirror key, but we're only in season 1. I haven't read all the comics, so we will see what happens. There's another key called the plant key that allows a user to control any plant. So, for example, Rendell and his friends, the keepers of the keys, as they called themselves, when they were teenagers, they used that tree to hide some memories of his little brother Duncan, because something goes haywire at a certain point, and Rendell had to do something terrible. Rendell was very much justified in doing what he did, but Duncan saw it, and it really upset him, and he didn't understand the context. So they had to extract those from his mind, and they put them into paint jars that they then buried in the ground. And then when you stick the plant key into the tree, then it opens up and lifts all of these paint jars with the memories out of the ground. So a lot of the keys that are used on the show are only introduced in the comics in a single panel, and they don't even all have names. So the plant key is one of those. It functions in that you stick the key into any sort of plant or tree or root, and you can make that plant do whatever you want pretty much. So the keepers of the keys use it to hide Duncan's memories underground so he wouldn't find them. And when Kinsey sticks the key back in it decades later, it helps the roots bring the memory jars back up. So it can be put into any type of tree, just like the identity and head keys can be put into any person, and it will make a keyhole for it. So in this case, they went ahead and used it on the same tree in the yard, but you could use it on technically anything. But it's not really in the comics. It's just something that they decided to utilize based off of the shape of the key and stuff in the panel. There's also the Omega key. So the Omega key is, the end all of the keys. It is a big deal. The key opens a door called the Black Door that's down in the sea caves of the city that the kids live in now, called Matheson. So we don't really know about what is beyond that door. It's just that it's in the very back of the sea caves that are also called the Drowning Caves, because when the tide comes in, folks tend to drown in there. And they really are kind of dangerous. They're super dangerous, actually, especially if you don't know when the tide's coming in or out. You've got to, know to look for high tide versus low tide and schedule your time around it. But if you're not familiar with boating or with the tides in general, then it can be bad news bears. And a lot of kids have died over the years in those sea caves. So when they go down into the caves, they find this door, and it's glowing blue. It's in the shape of a large lock, really. And it's a black door, but it's glowing like neon blue all around it. And we aren't entirely sure what it's for at first. And then we find out later that the door is bad news bears. We don't know what all is behind it, but we do know that is where one of the bad guys comes through, kind of like a glowing bullet, and takes over the body of one of the other characters. Now, it gets really scary at a certain point because they start telling their friends about everything, and then they use a combination of keys, or, the bad guy uses a combination of keys to really bamboozle all of them and trick them into doing something terrible. And when they do that, they do this terrible thing to the person that they care about, we see what happens to someone else who gets possessed by one of these glowing bullets. And we see her meeting up with another character who has been a different one in disguise the entire time. I won't tell you which one because I don't want to ruin it for you, but I gave the spoiler warning, but there's a whole lot going on in the show that is really cool, and I like how they used all the different keys. We're going to go another break, and when we come back, we are going to discuss how the writer and artist of Locke and Key feel about the changes made on the series.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
We were talking about the last of the keys that are used on the show in season 1. We're only in season 1 so far, so if you haven't finished it yet, go ahead and finish it out, but you got plenty of time because the show just aired a couple of weeks ago, and we have plenty of time to watch all of it before the next season comes out. So the writers, Joe Hill, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the son of Stephen King, and the artist, Gabriel Rodriguez, perhaps pronounced Gabriel, I'm not sure how they prefer their pronunciation, I will have to check that out, but they have talked about some of the big changes that were made on the screen. They were very curious about how they felt about Sam having less of a role in the show compared to the comics, and how a couple of the big keys were mixed into being a different key for the TV version. So they said that they very much understand that it has to work as a TV show, that there are certain things that you can tell in a comic that you can't tell as a TV show, especially with the limitations of budgets and really being able to get across, these really visual aspects that are easy to tell as a comic, but it's a lot harder with CGI or with practical effects. So they very much recognize the possibilities and limitations of telling their story in another format. And I really appreciate that perspective from them. So they said when they worked on the comic, they were always really trying to make it successful as a comic. And there were things that they could do there that you couldn't do in any other form. It was very much comic based in their conception of it and as they went along in developing it. So they made a comic that worked and thrived as a comic because that was their goal. So when it got picked up as a TV show, that is up to Carlton Cuse and Meredith Averill to really bring that to light in getting the cast and the production team together and finding something that would work on its own as a TV show. So they very much recognize that their comic is source material for this. And while they are happy with them being a very, bringing their baby to life, really, it's also good for them to recognize that it's difficult to do it exactly that same way. And I appreciate their perspective on it. Hill also said that the show is a work of dark fantasy that comments on horror, and it's more accessible than the very hardcore horror that the comics went for. So if you're looking for something a little bit darker, maybe check out the comics, and that might be for you. I'm not so much of a horror person unless it's monster movies like Jaws and stuff like that. So I really enjoy this version of Locke and Key. I might also enjoy the comics quite a bit. It just depends. But I like that this is kind of dark fantasy and how he illustrates that. So if you like The Labyrinth, you may like the TV show more. But if you're more into outright horror and gore and stuff, then maybe read the comics too. You can do both. So as far as changes made for TV, they thought that that was a really interesting choice, and they actually praised it as being a really satisfying one. So it's going to be more accessible to a wider variety of viewers, and it's going to be a little bit easier for people to watch. So it's a coming of age story, really, about these kids growing up, because at a certain point, they're not going to be able to remember anymore either when they become adults, ostensibly, as the story works. But at this point, they are still children, and so they're learning a lot. And our youngest protagonist is like 10 years old, and the oldest of the three kids is 17, the middle one's about 14. So in that regard, it's a lot for them to really be sitting here and going through some really gory stuff. Like, we want kids to be able to watch it too, and for kids to want to watch it, and for parents to allow their kids to watch it. So they did base it more in dark fantasy, so it's a little bit easier for, getting a wider variety of people on board. If you're reading horror comics, you probably already read other horror comics and have actively sought out the Locke and Key horror comic. Now, I really love that they are really nice about it and that they're happy with the way the creation has gone in translating to television. It's always nice when the creators and the people who are adapting their babies really get along well and appreciate each other's work. But if you're not familiar with Locke and Key, this show they've been trying to make it a show for a really long time. And it took about 12 years to get the show on Netflix. The comics have been around for quite a while, and it was very difficult for them to get it on screen, just for a variety of different issues. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. The co-runner, Meredith Averill, so Meredith and Carlton Cuse both co-run the show, and she has discussed this at length, explaining that there were a lot of different shades and tones that were hard to capture on film, especially when it's related to, how horror are we going to go? How dark in general do we want the tone, even if it's not a horror tone entirely? How dark is dark enough versus too dark? And they had trouble with that. She really gives the comics credit for doing a really good job of balancing different tones, like extreme horror, and then also the young adult stories and the romance plot lines as these kids are coming of age, and also elements of fantasy, because it's not just horror. There's also a lot of fantasy in it. There's a lot of fun in the show. And so it works really well in the comics, but they had a lot of difficulty adapting it. And they felt that they worked super hard in trying to find the right proportion where all the elements were working together and not against each other. So the comics did a really great job in marrying the tones, but they had a lot of trouble getting them to not clash and instead work really well on screen. So they say that it always makes more sense to explore the complexity of it via TV, because it gives the source material some space to breathe. But the first comic was published in 2008, and Dimension Films immediately announced that they wanted to make a movie adaptation for it. They had some financial issues at the studio at that point, and that quickly kind of ground it to a halt. But a year later, it was picked up the rights for it, that is, by Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci, who you may recognize from production credits in Star Trek. And then in 2010, Steven Spielberg was brought on as an executive producer, and everyone was really stoked to go forward with that. Now, the team completed a pilot for Fox in 2011, which had Miranda Otto in it. So you guys know her as Éowyn from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and also as the Aunt Zelda from Sabrina. And she was going to play the mom, Nina. And then Jesse McCartney was supposed to be playing her oldest son, Tyler. And yes, I mean Jesse McCartney, the singer, pop star. Everything looked really great, and then it went sideways, and Locke and Key's first pilot of several different pilots that were tried was just dead in the water. It didn't really work out. And they don't really know why that happened, but a lot of folks have postulated that there wasn't enough room on Fox's schedule for 2 supernatural shows, and the network had picked up J.J. Abrams' Alcatraz at that point, which didn't work out either, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that they were not able to pick up Locke and Key at the time. So after a while, Joe Hill wrote the final comic in 2014, so it ran about 6 years. And then Kurtzman and Orci announced plans to develop a movie trilogy for Universal. That didn't work out either, and then the rights reverted to IDW. Then Hulu decided they wanted to try it out, and they shot a pilot with the director of It, Andy Muschietti, and they did it just months before it came out in theaters, but that pilot was eventually passed on as well. So Carlton Cuse stuck with the project anyway and shopped it around until Netflix picked it up for a full season. Now, why did this version finally succeed where all of the others failed? We're not entirely sure, but Carlton Cuse says he thinks that it's the shift in tone and focus. He said, well, it ended up changing in a lot of ways. The Hulu pilot was a little more on the horror axis, and I think for Netflix, rightfully, they took the show more on a fantasy axis. The Netflix show focuses more on the kids, and it's more closely aligned to the things that were in the comic that everyone loved. So they really worked through each incarnation of the story in turn and managed to find what made it so special and bring it to the show. Carlton Cuse said it was kind of painful to go through such a long process, but he's really satisfied with the outcome at this point. And they learned a lot from the different iterations along the way. We're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about another horror comic, October Faction.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were wrapping up talking about Locke and Key, and now we're going to go ahead and talk about another horror comic, October Faction. Both of these shows were originally horror comics and are now Netflix shows. I think they have a lot in common, but there are enough significant differences to make them really interesting in their own right. Now, I know that Rotten Tomatoes only gave October Faction like a 20% rating on the tomato meter. I don't generally agree with Rotten Tomatoes anyway. So that's neither here nor there for me. If you do typically agree with them, then maybe this might not be for you. But for me, I like to watch things myself and make up my mind. So this show on Netflix was originally a horror comic made by Steve Niles and Damian Worm. It was called The October Faction, and it's super stylized and is gothic, kind of. And it has a ton of magic and monsters. They had to change a lot of it for Netflix's adaptation. So just like Locke and Key, there are certain things that you can get across on screen very well with a TV budget that, you know, you can get in a very different manner in comic books. So when Damien Kindler, who again did Sanctuary, went ahead and developed this for TV, they had to make a few differences. So they cast J.C. McKenzie and Tamara Taylor as the parents, Monster Hunters Fred and Dolores Allen, and Aurora Burkhart and Gabriel Darcou as the 17-year-old twins, Viv and Jeff. So the comics have the same core family, although their name is spelled a little bit differently. Sometimes that happens on shows, like when Stargate went from being a movie and Jack O'Neill's name had one L to Jack O'Neill having two L's in Stargate SG-1. Sometimes they just make that decision. So they made that in this situation, and they also kind of worked up the revelation that Jeff and Viv were adopted after Fred and Dolores killed their parents, who were a pair of warlocks. So that's a little bit hardcore in the story, but it is exactly the same in the comics. From there, though, the TV show builds its own story about them being these kind of globe-trotting family members who their parents get stationed at different places all around the world. Japan is where they were supposed to be at that point, and the kids were supposed to be starting their final year of school there. And then the parents got transferred to this small town. So they are in this tiny hometown of Barrington-on-Hudson, and certain characters are missing from the comics, and others have been changed, and we also have some new characters added. So there are a lot of significant differences in the TV show versus the comics for October Faction, whereas I think a lot more was kept intact for Locke and Key. But overall, they're both pretty cool. October Faction on Netflix is not as dark as the comics. The comics are very heavily horror and gore, and the Allens are almost like the Addams family in that way. They are proud weirdos, and they don't care about fitting into the normal world. However, with the TV show, you know, this is something that doesn't bother Viv that she doesn't fit in, but the parents are like, you need to work on your social skills. You need to try. So that's a big difference for them. Whereas the son, Jeff, is just totally comfortable in his own skin and in just, you know, being who he is all the time. Now, the casting for the show is also more diverse than the comics. The Allens are a mixed race family, and y'all know I am here for diversity. So I'm very excited to see that change with the comics. The mom in the comics was originally white, I believe, and I like that they have cast Tamara Taylor as Dolores. She is just BA in her own right. I love Tamara Taylor and everything. I have spoken to you guys about that previously, and it really brings some really interesting elements and sets us up for a really cool twist, too, that you normally expect from this type of show. So I really enjoyed that aspect too. They have a bunch of different characters in here, not just the family, who have had some differences made to them regarding skin tone. In the comics, Phil is a pale redhead, and he is played by Praneet Akilla in the show. And he's an Indian-Canadian actor. You've probably seen him in a lot of other TV shows as well. I was stoked to see his face. So beyond those differences, there are some more big changes from page to screen. In the comics, the company that they work for in the TV show, Presidio, does not even exist. So that's kind of really big. And by kind of, I mean that's major, of a huge difference. The TV show has the Presidio Foundation, which is like this global organization that is out to hunt down and get rid of people who are supernatural. They don't consider them people, though. I suppose they would call them monsters. But in the comics, Presidio doesn't exist. The Allens are instead independent monster hunters. Kind of like a whole family, but, of like Supernatural. So Supernatural, it's the family business, but this would be a mom, a dad, and the kids being like a family-run supernatural detective agency. And then Presidio really expands the scope of the show beyond just the Allen family and their town. And I think that helps a lot, and it sets up a force for them to rebel against. I love it when characters really find out that they are the bad guy. Like, they firmly believed in their mission and everything up to this point, and then they realize that they're the bad guy. A lot of times, I think in real life, people don't recognize when they're the bad guy, and so it's just very heartening for me to see it on screen. And also, I just love that shock and how it sets you up for some good, solid character growth as well. It's a big turning point in these characters' lives. So I thought that was pretty cool. Being part of the Presidio also means that the TV versions get to use more high-tech weaponry, whereas in the comics, they were more likely to use a mix of guns and magic and axes and stuff. So closer to Supernatural, but also with more magic. They also have several monster friends in the comics. In the TV show, they don't really have any. But in the comics, they abound. So the audience and the Allens have been brought around to the idea by the end of the season of October Faction that not all monsters are bad and that often humans are the worst of all. Humans are the real monsters. And I like that concept a lot in the TV show. In general, they are saying that you could really view this TV show as a prequel to the comics because in the comics it's established very early on that the dad has a friend who's a werewolf and has to stay a wolf because his human form has cancer. So I like that aspect of the comic. I think that's very interesting, and it gives us more of like a Deadpool type feeling in that regard. It gives us something that's really complex, and I enjoy that twist to it. And the Allens also have a lot of strange allies in the comics. The further along you get, the more vampires and werewolves and ghouls and stuff that you experience. There are so many of them. Sometimes the kids date them as well, and I love that. They are on kind of friendly-ish terms with certain people in the TV show that we don't quite know are, vampires and stuff yet necessarily, or we don't know are love interests yet, but it's really cool to see the TV show starting before that point and hopefully ultimately catching up to the comics regarding them having a lot of different friends. There are also a lot of new family members. So Samuel and Maggie Allen are really new family members, and they also have a backstory for Fred about his brother's death. I really enjoyed that as well, and they also use that to craft a backstory for another character. It's really super cool how they piggyback these off of each other, and Damian Kindler has always been really great at truly exploring these types of story elements in depth. So he's really great at piggybacking them off of each other and intertwining them until they are just beautifully spiderwebbed. So I really enjoy seeing it come up in this show. So I'm not going to ruin the ending of it for you. It's really great. You should definitely watch the show. I definitely gave you guys some spoilers today, but it's been out for a little bit. And in the comics, Dante just looks a lot different. So he's like a cyborg in the TV show, but in the comics, most of his body is robotic. It's mostly robotic parts, at least most of his face. So he just has one robotic eye in the TV show, but that makes it a little bit easier, I think, to get it across. We're going to go another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the biggest difference from the comic books and how the person who wrote it feels about it.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Before the break, we were talking about October Faction and how it is deviated from the comics significantly. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the biggest difference and how author Steve Niles really feels about that. I'm always very interested to learn how the creators of the source material feel about their babies being on screen, and this is no different. So in this case, October Faction was released on Netflix a month ago now, which is why I'm talking to y'all about it at this point. And it's a 10-part series that's focused on the monster hunters. And in this case, it's very different from the comics because it's not a family thing. Now, Damian Kindler is really dope. I've talked to you guys before about how he was involved with Sleepy Hollow and Sanctuary and Stargate Atlantis and has been bringing the series to life. Damian's not the only director on the show, though, and Director X, who has mostly been famous for directing music videos, has directed some of these episodes as well. And there are a few other writers and directors, too. So, with this show, what is the biggest difference? Well, Steve Niles created the show back in 2014, so the year that Joe Hill ended the last comic we were talking about, Locke and Key. That's when October Faction started, and fellow author Damian Worm created that with him. So they were really excited for Netflix to pick up the show, and they are stoked with how it has turned out. So they really believe that the Netflix show has given the story a lot of depth and breadth, and that it's really the comic now plus a serious backstory. So they really enjoy all of the additions to it. They're really enjoying the backstory, and they said that their favorite part is how all of the actors have really brought the characters to life. They describe that as being thrilling, and that they think Damian Kindler is brilliant. So I'm so heartwarmed by seeing that work out really well for them, especially after all of the drama with Star Wars in the past few years. It's really nice that this one has turned out well, even with substantive changes. They said that they were really involved regarding approving scripts and directions, but they made sure that they didn't hover over any of the directors and the writers and the crew. They're like, we fully trusted Damian to get this correctly and make it great, so we're not upset about any of this. We are stoked. Now, they do think that the biggest difference is because, Fred and Dolores are members of Presidio in the TV show. And Steve Niles says he thinks that's the main change from the comic books. I totally agree. Of course, my opinion doesn't matter. He is the creator of it. He would know best. But, that's a big difference for it. And he says the characters in general are very much the same. But in the comic, Fred and Dolores were more self-motivated as monster hunters. And they weren't really, working for some higher power at that time. So that's really the big difference. But the characters themselves are very much the same. They and another partner that they have in the comics were fighting monsters on their own. There was no real organization. It was just them deciding that's what they wanted to do. They were good at it. They had the ability. They just felt like it. So they went and hunted monsters. But it was very much underground. So Damian wanted to make it bigger with the Presidio and make it like a historical thing, so they really liked that change. They dropped all 10 episodes of it on Netflix at once on January 23rd, I do believe. So if you haven't binge watched the series yet, it's a great one for it. I really enjoy the characters and getting to know the kids and their friendships. If you really liked the wholesomeness of Barb in Stranger Things, I think you'll really like the first friend that Viv makes. I really enjoy her. She's super sweet and kind and chill, but also really dorky, and I dig that about her. I also love that Viv is a fantastic artist in her own right, which is very similar to Kinsey in Locke and Key. That's just something the two of them have in common. But Viv is very talented, and I love seeing her excel at things on screen. Also with being fluent in so many languages. It's just a super diverse show that is really cool in a lot of ways, with it still maintaining a lot of the horror components, although it is largely more dark fantasy than horror, just like the Locke and Key adaptation. And the synopsis for the show says, "Nothing's as scary as the specters of the past or ugly antiques." So that really captures the tongue-in-cheek nature of a lot of the interactions between the characters. There's a lot of sarcasm and sass, and at one point you see the characters going out there and having to fight a vampire after they've smoked a joint in the car at a funeral. So it's very fun to me how they brought that to life, because it's like, okay, these people are grieving. They're doing something they might not normally do anyway. They found a joint in his dead father's car, and so they're like, you know what, we're gonna do this. And so they hotbox it outside of the grocery store and then have to go in, and there are some monsters in there that they have to fight. So I really enjoyed seeing that, and it's like, you can't be, totally in your own element all of the time. So we see Dean on Supernatural drunk a lot. Dean drinks a lot anyway, but both of them do, but mostly Dean. But you don't really see him incapacitated a ton. Whereas in this case, Fred, played by J.C. McKenzie, he has a lot of complex feelings about his father's death. His father was not a cool guy. He's not nice, and I mean by that. And so he has a lot of feelings about it. And when he goes to process them, he's drinking a lot. They run out of booze at the funeral, and they're like, okay, we're going to go get it. And he's like, I'm going to drive. And she's like, you're definitely not driving. So not only is he stoned like she is when they go into the grocery store to have this fight, but also he is drunk on top of that. And she goes to hand him a weapon, and he's like, wait, why can't I have the gun? And she goes, because you're drunk. You cannot have this firearm right now. She's like, I don't even think you could aim properly. And so he gets like a knife, I think. So it's really funny to me how they are being conscious of that, but also poking fun of it at the same time. So, she's very much like, okay, you definitely can't have a gun. Like, we're in a grocery store. That's not safe. But also, you are kind of incapacitated. We have to hunt these monsters right now, but this is less than ideal. And it cracks me up even more when they split up for it a little bit, because there are multiple monsters in there. So he's just kind of walking around drunk and stoned, talking to these monsters a little bit. And he's real edgy about it, but he's like, okay, I'll listen to you talk for a little bit. And the monster's like, man, just let me go. And he's like, nope, I can't do that. But he's also clearly not in a headspace to be able to have a lot of control over his motor skills. And so it just cracks me up the way that he approaches it, and how Dolores kind of has to come by and be like, man, like, really? And it's her husband too. So it's her husband and her partner. So the interplay there is really interesting. And I also enjoy that we get to start the show out with them already being in a relationship. They are already partners and in a relationship. So we're not worrying about the sexual tension, but we can also tell that they love each other very much. The sexual tension is more reserved for other characters throughout the series, like between Phil and Jeff and stuff. So I enjoy that aspect a lot. I think it is a lot of fun the way they approach it. If you want to see more of the horror and gore, definitely go and check out the comics. They seem really awesome. Just keep in mind, there's a lot of differences between the two, but that can also be fun from my perspective, where we get to have a bunch of different versions of our characters, almost like alternate timelines in a way, or like creator Steve Niles said, you can approach it as this being more of like a prequel or backstory for all of the characters, and then go and read the comics. I think that is really interesting regarding how the show works. Ignore Rotten Tomatoes. That's just other people's opinions. Go and watch the show and make up your own mind about it. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.